If you're new with us, we've been going through the book of Daniel on Sundays. And so far in the book, we've seen Daniel when he was relatively young. So the book actually starts out with Daniel being a young teenager. But now we come to chapter 5. And in chapter 5, Daniel is an old man now. He's an old man. And the other main character from the first 4 chapters, the great King Nebuchadnezzar, well, he's been dead for 22 years at this point. And Daniel is now serving under a very different kind of king. He's serving under King Belshazzar, who is Nebuchadnezzar's son. And he's an interesting character. Let's check him out, shall we? Let's turn to Daniel chapter 5. And we'll cover the whole chapter today, but I won't read the whole chapter. That can be your homework this week. What I will do is I will read Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, and then I will jump to verses 17 and read to the end, okay? So if you have your Bible, you can turn there now. If you don't have a Bible, it's okay. The verses will be on the screen behind me. Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. Verse 17. Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox. And his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then, at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. This is God's word. So it's pretty amazing, I think, how many of the stories of Daniel have made it into our modern culture. So even atheists today will commonly use the phrase, the writing is on the wall. Y'all have heard that, right, a lot? Well, that phrase comes straight from this chapter, okay, straight from this book. And so what's interesting is we'll see in Daniel that there's actually quite a few elements of Daniel, this very book, that have made it into our modern culture. And this is one of them, a very famous story from Daniel chapter 5. And so let's take a look a little bit closer at this very famous story and look at the three elements of it, and let's see what they're teaching us today. Okay? So point number one in your outline is the party. The party. So even atheists today are somewhat relatively familiar with this story. They certainly know the overall gist, that there was a hand that came and wrote on the wall. But what most people don't realize is that the setting of this story is a wild party. Keyword, wild. This is a wild party, all right? So King Belshazzar is throwing this party, and we see first that his wives are there. But we are also told that his concubines are there too. Now this probably doesn't strike you as very interesting or unusual here in 21st century America, but let me tell you this. Kings in the ancient Near East would never do that. Never. You never had your concubines and your wives in the same room. Okay? It's kind of logical when you think about it, but this would never happen. Okay? And so this right here, this element of the story is frankly scandalous. This is extremely unusual. And so what's going on here? Why did he do that? Well, this is an intentional effort by King Belshazzar to create a scene of sensuality and scandalous pleasure. Okay, that's what this party is. Next, we see the king. He calls for the gold and silver goblets that the Babylonian soldiers stole from Jerusalem's temple after they conquered Jerusalem. So if you don't know the story, Babylon had conquered Israel. They conquered the nation of Judah. They razed the temple and they stole a bunch of stuff from Yahweh's temple, and they took it back to Babylon with them. You might remember that from chapter 1. And so at this party, everybody's getting plastered, okay? And they are toasting their own pagan gods on wine that they are drinking from Yahweh's cups. Okay? That's what they're doing. Now, this scene is a far cry from the end of the last chapter. A far cry. So if you turn back just one page, you see that under King Nebuchadnezzar, the religion of Yahweh had made major inroads. In fact, if you look at the very last verse of the previous chapter, it kind of looks like Nebuchadnezzar himself has become a convert to Yahwehism. Okay? But those days are gone now. Those days are gone. King Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar, he is giving double birds to Yahweh, obviously, in this story. But why is he doing that? So what exactly is this party all about? I mean, why throw this wild party? What's the purpose of it? Well, history tells us something really interesting. So history tells us that about a week or so, give or take, before this story, what happened was about 50 miles outside of Babylon, King Cyrus of Persia brought his army down to fight the Babylonian army. And he slaughtered them. He slaughtered them. I mean, King Cyrus absolutely routed the Babylonian army just a week before this. Which means at this moment in time, the great city of Babylon is completely defenseless. They have no army. And a massive enemy army is just a stone's throw away now, just 50 miles down the road. So obviously, the people of the city were in full panic mode. Full panic. They know what this means. They're in full panic mode, uncertain about what was going to happen next. And how does King Belshazzar respond? By throwing a party. Huh? Why would you do that? You're about to be slaughtered. Why are you throwing this insanely wild party at a time like this? I mean, think about it. Out of all the times to throw this crazy party, why does he pick now? When his city is completely defenseless, his enemy is at the doorstep. Why does he throw it now? Well, we don't really know why. The text doesn't say why he did this. But most scholars think this. It was, at the very least, it was a naive, prideful denial of reality. Just a prideful denial of reality. He just couldn't honestly face what was coming to him. He couldn't face it. But you know, the point of the text, I think the main point of this text is that really, this is what all of us do. We just don't have the money or the power or the influence that King Belshazzar had. But we do the same thing all the time. Every day, actually. Our whole lives just are this party. That's what it is. It's a full-on extravagant denial of certain death. Ernest Becker was a skeptic, a terrific writer, and a deep thinker, and he wrote this. I agree. Here's what he says. He says, human beings cannot live with the full, honest awareness of our impending deaths. We cannot live with that reality. Death is too bleak, too terrible a reality. And so, what do? We pretend like it's not going to happen, like we're just going to live forever. We fill our lives with pleasure after pleasure, keeping ourselves busy, scrolling, all to distract ourselves from the reality of what's coming to us. I'll raise my hand nice and high too. I do the same thing. We are like the orchestra. You all know that, remember that little orchestra in the movie Titanic who just keeps playing even while the ship is sinking into the abyss? You remember that? This is how you and I deal with the undeniable fact of our deaths. The ship is sinking, and we just keep playing. Keep partying, pretending like it's not happening. And so, what does God do to help us? Does He do anything to help us? Yeah, He does. It's pretty cool what He does, actually. What God does is He sends us a party crasher. That's point number 2 in your outline. The party crasher. So King Belshazzar, he sees the hand and the writing on the wall, and he almost faints with fear. He is petrified. And so what he does is he calls in his enchanters. And he says, fellas, I will clothe you in purple. I will give you gold. I will make you the third highest ruler in the kingdom if you'll just tell me what the writing says on the wall. But then we see that none of his enchanters could do it. They ain't got a clue what the writing means. So what do? They go get old Daniel. They go get Daniel, the party crasher. And crash this party, he does. Big time. And so what does Daniel say when he arrives? First of all, he rejects the king's gifts of purple and gold. He's like, no thanks. Hard pass on the gold and the purple. Now why? Why does he pass on that? It's because Daniel knows he can interpret the writing. He knows what the writing says. But throughout this book, if you've been with us for the last several weeks, you know this. Daniel refuses to take credit for anything. He just refuses. He will not do it. He will not pat himself on the back for anything. Okay? And so why is that? Well, it's because he knows, even though he has some extraordinary abilities, he knows that the only reason he can do anything at all is because God gives him the ability to. These aren't his gifts. Daniel knows he's not anything special. These are all gifts from God. And so he says to Belshazzar, if you want to give out crowns, give them to Yahweh. Don't give them to me. I don't need them. Do you see how this perspective could help us? Right, so Daniel sees all of life as a gift. All of it. And one reason you and I are so afraid of death is because we have some amazing things in this life. Amazing. We have breath in our lungs, which is pretty nice. We have a family who we love. We have talents, we have love, we have art, we have music, etc., etc., etc. We love these things. They are fabulous things. But folks, we didn't earn any of them. Okay? We don't deserve them. We only have them because our gracious God gifted them to us. See? They're just gifts. I had a friend in Gunnersville who died of cancer at 28 years old. And he told me before his death that though initially when the cancer diagnosis came, he was terrified of death. He said that he eventually came to see, though, that his short life is a precious gift from God. And so he told me this. He said, I now realize that I don't deserve one breath in my lungs. Not one. And so now I treasure all the breaths and people and moments and memories God has gifted to me. What a perspective. Similar to Daniel's. Very similar. But that's not all Daniel says to crash the party. Secondly, Daniel explicitly calls out the pride of King Belshazzar. He calls him out. Now, what is pride exactly? Like, what is pride? Let me give you a definition of what pride is. Pride is the inability to see life as Daniel does. Okay? It's the inability to see life as a pure gift of God's grace. That's what pride is. You see, King Belshazzar, he looks at this great city of Babylon, possibly the greatest city in the history of the world. He looks at this city and he says, this city is mine. I run this city. I call the shots here. I run this show. He says, I earned it, I worked for it, I deserve it. This is my city, this is my throne, this is my crown. But you know, are we really any different from Belshazzar? I know I'm not. Like, you just can't tell because I don't have the wealth or the power that Belshazzar has. So you can't tell how arrogant I am, how prideful I am, and how often I pull my shoulder out of socket. Patting myself on the old back for all the great things I have in my life. I have some great things. And I want to do exactly what Belshazzar does. I want to. That's what I want to do. I got some great things in my life, and I want to say I earned it. I worked for it. I deserve it. I deserve my great family. I deserve my great home. I deserve my great church. I deserve it because I worked hard. And then, God sends me a 28-year-old with terminal cancer to crash my party. Let me tell you something. That 28-year-old friend of mine was a Daniel to me. His words cut deep. I would come home crying every time I ate lunch with him. We would eat lunch maybe once or twice a month, and I would tell Catherine, I'd be like, you won't believe what he said. Like, just the words were so profound and cut me deep. And thank God, because I needed cutting. I still do. Thankfully, I'll always have his words. His words still ring really loudly in my ears. I think about them all the time. I need Daniels in my life. Thankfully, God is gracious enough to send me some. Thankfully, He's gracious enough to send you some if you'll pay attention to them. He's sending you some Daniels, and they're great. They're great. They're really helpful. But I'll tell you this. Though I did need a Daniel, I need something more than a Daniel. I do need a Daniel, but I also need something more. And so do you. So do you. What is that? It's point number 3 in our outline today. Point number 3, the fingers of God. The fingers of God. All right, so the very hand of God enters this wild party, and it begins to write on the wall. And what is the message that the fingers of God write on the wall? The message says this. It says, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Now that's another phrase that's made it into our modern culture, isn't it? You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Essentially, then, the writing on the wall is a curse against King Belshazzar. And that very night, Belshazzar is slain. Now, but what does the writing on the wall mean for us? What does it mean for you and me? Well, it means exactly the same thing as it meant for Belshazzar. You see, friends, I hate to break it to you, but you have been weighed on the scales of righteousness and been found wanting. So have I. All have fallen short of the glory of God. We are prideful. We are death deniers. We are sinners. And so, are we therefore under the same curse as Belshazzar? No, we are not. Why is that? It's because someone has already taken the curse for us in our place. You see, in Luke chapter 11, Jesus says that He destroys the power of hell by the fingers of God. That's what He says. And scholars say that that is a direct reference to Daniel chapter 5. He says He destroys the powers of hell with the fingers of God, referencing this story. But wait a minute. Wait a minute. Didn't the fingers of God write a curse on the wall? Yes, they did. It's exactly what they did. And that, friends, is exactly how Jesus destroys the powers of hell. He takes the curse upon himself. Jesus, you see, friends, is your substitute. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he stands in your place, and he hears these words from God. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting, and therefore you will be slain. The Apostle Paul puts it like this. Paul says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God. Do you see? In other words, Jesus, through his death on the cross, has transformed the writing on the wall from a curse to a blessing. See? He was found wanting so that we can be found righteous. And so the writing is still on the wall. The message is still the same. We have been weighed on the scales, and we've been found wanting. And we rightfully deserve to be slain. But don't you see? Though the writing is still on the wall, there isn't a sad face at the end of it anymore. Now, there's a smiley face at the end. Because of Jesus. Because of Jesus, now we see that he took the curse of the writing on the wall so that we could get the inverse of the writing on the wall. He gets the curse, we get the blessings. You see? Because of Jesus, we don't have to throw our fake parties anymore. We don't have to stick our heads in the sand. We don't have to keep ourselves busy, trying to avoid the reality of death. Jesus' cross has completely transformed the meaning of death for us. Don't you see? Because of Jesus, we can now look our impending death square in the face. And we can join the Apostle Paul in saying, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" Where's your stinger, bud? Jesus tore it out at the cross. Death is nothing but the gateway to victory now. That's all that it is. Jesus took the curse of death so that you and I will get the blessing of eternal life. The hymn writer, I love this so much. I've used it before, but I'm going to use it again. The hymn writer puts it so beautifully. Listen to this. He says, "O Christ, what burdens bowed thy head, our load was laid on thee. Thou stoodest in the sinner's stead, didst bear all ill for me. A victim led, thy blood was shed. Now there's no load for me." The curse of death was in our cup. The cup was full for thee. But thou hast drained the last dark drop and emptied it for me. That bitter cup, love drank it up. Now there's no curse for me.